communities that were outraged about a cop being who got away with murder, as far as we're concerned.
Amy Allison.
The protests in Oakland after Johannes Mezerly, the former BART officer, was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, which many people thought was a very easy verdict after what we saw. Social media spread the word and let everyone see the video, so we all saw it. And then the verdict was surprising to many people. If you compare, though, the way that the protests were covered 2 weeks ago and the way they were covered a year ago, it was night and day. Social media came and changed the whole conversation about what Oaklanders think. It was a lot more diverse and nuanced and powerful. We were able to capture and share the message out beyond not only to Oakland but to the world of how Oaklanders had come together in nonviolence. We were able to tell a story about how the local peace movement had taken the lead and working with the city. But all of this happened in the context locally of a very important urban issue, which is that Oakland is struggling, as many cities are, with revenue and with dealing with deficits. And we had just had the fight with the police officers union and a sense of how the city was going to avoid cutting more libraries and schools. And so the whole coverage of the protests happened in a political environment where social media was able to say, look, we want to hold police accountable for their activities out in the street. We want to have a broader conversation about crime and public safety. And we're not going to accept the narrative a year ago that there was just a bunch of rioting and we need more cops. That was directly as a result of citizens themselves and bloggers, as well as other folks telling the story and talking to each other about the impact of not only the violence that happened against Oscar Grant in the first place, but the policing and the aftermath.
David.
One thing that I think is important is that there's a context to even revolting. And what social media allowed us to do was explain what happened the first time there were riots in the street, which was 7 days of 7 days of the mayor not speaking, 7 days of the district attorney not speaking, 7 days of people going up and going, what's going on? And then people saying, okay, we'll let you know what's going on, and having a revolt and having a political and social context to that. Even what happened after the verdict, there was a way to explain that narrative, which was counter to what the mainstream was. The other thing that's important is that mainstream has become increasingly more embedded. What they didn't tell you in the recent verdict was the fact that many of the mainstream journalists were standing right next to the police. They were embedded with them, so they had the best angles. And I never seen that before. I know that it goes on overseas in war, but to come here and say, hey, wait a second, you're ABC, CBS, you're right there next to the cops. So what does that mean at the end of the day when the story is told? I couldn't cover the way that I would normally, even with a press pass, because they said we made new press passes and you have to have a special one and you have to be standing next to the police. That's very different and that's very dangerous because it's in the context of news being censored and controlled and manipulated by corporations all over the country, and that was just a prime example of that taking place in Oakland. In this case, with the police, but corporations and police are the same thing. If you look at what BP is doing, censoring media, so I don't see it as being very different. It's just controlling the narrative.
You know, it's interesting you raise this because when we were arrested in St. Paul, my colleagues Sharif Abdel-Quddus and Nicole Salazar, and I arrested by the St. Paul police covering the Republican National Convention. We weren't alone among journalists. There were more than 40 journalists arrested. When I went the next morning after I was released to the police chief's news conference and asked him, what does he expect journalists to do and what has he instructed his police to do if they're arresting journalists? He said we could embed with the mobile field force, using that model of reporters embedding in the front lines of troops as a way to cover American cities. Cheryl Conti, do you want to weigh in here?
Right, and so in this changing environment in the media, social media provides an unfiltered voice. No longer do we have an intermediary to tell us the story, as we did before, where the journalists represented the community's voice. Now the community has their own voice. And during the Oscar Grant protests and rallies, you know, you got pictures live from the scene, and on our blog we actually listed some of the Twitter reports just to show this is what's actually happening on the ground, just to provide a balance with the mainstream media.
It reminds me of the Battle of Seattle 10 years ago, when you had CNN saying that, repeating the police line, that they weren't using rubber bullets, but we were picking them up by the handfuls. And it was Indie Media and IndieMedia.com that really exploded on the scene then, when these pictures were being showed, and you had more people hitting IndieMedia.com than CNN.com.
And see, I think that's an excellent point, because through the Johannes Messerly protests, Oakland scene, Facebook and Twitter followers grew more than 40%, and people started to acknowledge, hey, you know what, for the information on the ground and the real unfiltered stuff that's happening, I got to go to a source like Oakland Scene, because if I turn on the news, I'm really going to get the same stories, and it's not really reflective of what I think about my own city, or the kind of the details I'm looking for. So people are starting to turn in a city like Oakland to alternative news sources, and I think that that's fabulous, particularly in a place locally where our papers have consolidated and local coverage has suffered so much.
David D.
I think one of the other important things is that when you look at a situation like the Oscar Grant scenario, none of us are really organizers. I'm not an organizer, but there was dozens of organizers there whose voices never get heard. They don't show up on the evening news. They're not often quoted, and there's a context to which they speak. And so one of the things that social media allowed us to do was really get the full narrative from their perspective, whether it was Uncle Bobby, Oscar's uncle, why he condemned, some of the coverage that was going on, or why he talked about what the police were doing. We got to hear his full thing, why he rejected Messerly's apology without just the 30-second soundbite that was played around the nation, but the full 4-minute speech that he gave. And that becomes important. What did the organizers think? What were they doing? How did they all come together were just as important as the trial and the verdict itself. And those important stories got out to the rest of the country in a way that inspired folks, let people know that there's a richer context to what was taking place in Oakland. And lastly, it put a spotlight on the media, because it showed how lazy they were when all these stories were being unearthed. And you're going, well, wait a second, you're the mainstream media with millions of dollars in the budget. How come we just got this very two-dimensional narrative?
Cheryl Conti, as we wrap up, tomorrow you're going to be hosting Nancy Pelosi. She'll be addressing the Netroots Nation convention. You're Jill Tubman at Jack and Jill Politics. Why Jill Tubman?
Originally, many of the black political bloggers wrote under pseudonyms, because the history of the United States shows that outspoken African Americans are often targets one way or another. And so I was frankly afraid to write under my full voice until I really understood the consequences of what that would be, and it allowed me to write more freely. I came out of the closet, if you will, of the blog closet about 2 years ago, and it was fantastic to really receive a lot of applause. So I'm really looking forward to sitting down with Speaker Pelosi and representing the community. It's an interactive session, so we've been taking comments from the internet. People are voting with their feet. People really want to know about the Youth Promise Act, for example. They want to know about Social Security, the economy, jobs, and so I'm really looking forward to having a chance to reflect that.
If people want to participate, where do they go? How do they?
Right. So if people, you can still ask questions to me. You can use the hashtag NN10 Pelosi on Twitter. You can go to the Netroots Nation Facebook, or you can go to Jack and Jill Politics, and you'll see there's a blog post stuck to the top right now, and leave a comment.
And where do people go to find Oakland Scene, Amy Allison?
Oakland Scene, SEEN.com. And we have a Facebook group and a Twitter group. So we not only report and encourage people to blog and contribute media, but we're talking to each other, which is amazing.
Davey D.
You can reach me at davyD.com or Mr. Davey D, DAVEYD, on Twitter.
Thanks very much for being with us here at the Netroots Nation. Davey D, Cheryl Conti, a.k.a. Jill Tubman, and Amy Allison. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, the mainstream media focuses on Republicans versus Democrats. Well, here it's, can progressives capture the Democratic Party? Stay with us.